Thank you all, and thank you especially for being here tonight. I want to thank the people who were on the panel and the audience who showed up. That was a fascinating discussion. I think set the table for tonight's program really, really well. And we also know you had choices tonight. There's the Public Narrative Journalism event, the Medill Journalism School has an event. I was just told the Auditorium Theater has an event, so thank you for choosing this one, and we'll do our best to make it worth your while. Whether this is your first BJ event or you've been a member for years, whether you've won a Driehaus Award already or this is your first nomination, it's great to see you here tonight. The journalists and newsrooms represented here tonight are some of the best across Chicago, Illinois, and the nation. They join a legacy that goes back 20 years. Their great work stands tall among, over the years, 450 entries from newsrooms across Illinois and Chicago, and the 95 finalists in all that time. The quality of entries tonight is as high as ever. In fact, 2 of our finalists earned a Pulitzer Prize this week. Congratulations to Sarah Conway of City Bureau and Tina Reynolds-Tyler of the Investigative Institute. They won in the local news category for a piercing series showing how racism and neglect in the Chicago Police Department figured into unresolved cases of missing women and girls. Thanks for your great journalism and congratulations again. And for those who weren't here for the panel earlier tonight, the founder of the Invisible Institute, Jamie Calvin, is with us tonight. Jamie. There is something important happening in nonprofit news in Chicago. The Invisible Institute Pulitzers this year, they won another one by the way, add to one they also won in 2021. Now City Bureau has joined in on the Pulitzer ranks. And your host tonight, the BJ, I have to say, won our first Pulitzer 2022. Our series with the Tribune showed city negligence that led to 61 fire deaths in the city of Chicago. On a national basis, a quarter of this year's Pulitzer finalists were nonprofit news organizations. 4 of them won. And in tonight's Driehaus Awards, 2/3 of the finalists are nonprofit newsrooms. Nonprofit journalism is possible largely because of the support of members, subscribers, individuals, and philanthropic foundations who support this work. Such investment has kept the BJ going for a century now. We started in the era of Al Capone, when journalists, business people, clergy, and public officials decided to fight back against the corrupt City Hall. And no one has been more important in our long history to the success of the BJ than Richard H. Driehaus, the namesake of tonight's awards. 2 decades ago, he committed $1 million to the BJ at a time when we were down to 3 staff and a $300,000 annual budget. Mr. Driehaus made a bet on us, and as part of that, he honored the BJ with the responsibility of stewarding the awards given in his name, the Richard H. Driehaus Awards for Investigative Reporting. I'm glad to say the relationship continues. A nearly $1.5 million commitment from the Driehaus Foundation has made it possible for the BJ's Illinois Answers Project to hire a team of journalists who engage with newsrooms statewide, producing investigative and solutions-focused reporting that those newsrooms can no longer afford to do. This grant is an important part of our push into solutions-focused journalism, one of the most effective ways to light the path toward reform in government and society. I want to thank the Driehaus Foundation, as well as tonight's other Second Century sponsors, Heather Staines and Leo Smith, our platinum sponsors, Gary Eldon and Phyllis Mandler, and our gold sponsors, the Inland Real Estate Group of Companies, the Joseph and Bessie Feinberg Foundation, Carol Joins and Abby McCormick O'Neill, and Mark Rust and the Barnes and Thorburg Law Firm. These generous sponsors are not acting alone. Everyone here tonight is a supporter of revelatory, high-impact journalism. And if you're inclined to kick in financially, you'll be glad to know it's never too late. The postcards and QR codes in your program will help you contribute directly to the Illinois Answers Project and our effort to produce reporting that addresses inequity, waste, and fraud in government. Investigative journalism has the power to force us to confront our government and society with truths they often would rather ignore. The crusading Chicago journalist Ida B. Wells put it succinctly: "The way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth on them." Tonight, her words are a fitting way to introduce the main program. Ida B. Wells' fearless fight against lynchings in the South, racism at the Chicago World's Fair, segregation in Chicago public schools, and the disenfranchisement of women helped move this nation a bit closer to our promise. And because of this, she's a hero to many in this room, including our special guest tonight, Nicole Hannah-Jones. Ida B. Wells' work has much in common with the work Nicole is doing today. Her crusading reporting about segregation and racial bias in schools and housing, and Nicole's role in creating the 1619 Project have ignited a reckoning in American society that is just beginning to unfold. There is a through line from Ida B. Wells to Nicole Hannah-Jones to the great journalism we honor here tonight. All have done the important work of a free press and hardworking journalists across the country, protecting our democracy, exposing inequity, helping to shape an informed citizenry, and holding government accountable for serving all of its residents. In other words, shining the light of truth to right wrongs. Tonight's Driehaus Awards finalists and winners were selected by an independent panel of investigative reporting experts. Thank you to Charles Whitaker, Jesus Del Toro, Jackie Spinner, and Chris Bury for serving as judges again this year. The awards program will start in just a bit. Ann Lazar and Nick Burt of the Driehaus Foundation will announce honorees in 2 categories, one each for both large and small newsrooms. But first, a conversation with Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's going to be quite a night. And now it's my pleasure to turn this over to Ruby Bailey, Editor-in-Chief of the Illinois Answers Project.
Good evening, everyone. It is my honor and privilege right now to introduce our panelists who are going to come out tonight and talk to us, obviously about a conversation that we know will take us far beyond the byline. So I'm going to introduce our wonderful panelists, and then they will all come out at the same time, so please hold your applause. And should any questions arise during our conversation, please send them my way using the QR code that's on the screen or on the back of your program. And now I'm going to introduce, for all of you, our esteemed panel. We have Jewel Jackson, who is an investigative reporter for, obviously, the Illinois Answers Project. She covers education. She is focused on education for us since she started here with us. And she is focusing on that and has done so also when she covered higher education in El Paso for the El Paso Matters in El Paso, Texas. And she has also covered various social justice movements in her hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. Ms. Jackson has produced numerous segments for local national public radio stations and is an alumna of the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. Illinois Answers senior investigative reporter Madison Hopkins, our 2022 Pulitzer Prize winner, joined the BGA in 2016. Hopkins won journalism's top honor in local reporting for a year-long investigation that David mentioned to you a few moments ago with the Chicago Tribune that chronicled bureaucratic failures that contributed to dozens of fatal fires. She earned her master's degree from the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Our featured guest, Nicole Hannah-Jones, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning creator of the 1619 Project and a staff writer at the New York Times Magazine. Her book, the 1619 Project, is now a 6-part docuseries on Hulu and won the Emmy for Outstanding Documentary or Nonfiction Series. Hannah-Jones has spent her career investigating racial inequality and injustice. Her reporting has earned her the MacArthur Fellowship, known as the Genius Grant, a Peabody Award, 2 George Polk Awards, and the National Magazine Award 3 times. She also serves as the Knight Chair of Race and Journalism at Howard University, where she founded the Center for Journalism and Democracy. Hannah Jones is also the co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting, which seeks to increase the number of investigative reporters and editors of color. In 2022, she opened the 1619 Freedom School, a free after-school literacy program in her hometown of Waterloo, Iowa. And now with that, please welcome our guest panelists, Jewel, Madison, and Nicole Hannah-Jones.
Well, thank you so much for all of you for being here, and thank you to Nicole for being here for this conversation. We are so excited to be able to talk with you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I can't even begin to tell you how much this moment means. So thank you. Thank you to our audience as well for being here and being part of this conversation with us today. There's so many things that we can talk to you about today, but we're gonna, I think, focus on two little things: democracy and journalism. Just little things. In 2022, you founded the Center for Journalism and Democracy at Howard University with the goal to push for pro-democracy journalism, a term that you've said is defined by acknowledging journalism is inherently a form of activism. I think, though, a lot of us wouldn't really think journalism, activism really fits into the same sentence. So I'm curious, then, can you explain a little bit more as to what pro-democracy journalism is and how we're currently missing the mark on that as an industry?
Sure. So these seats are very awkward, which is why y'all are sitting up like that. I can't quite figure out how to sit in this thing. Hello, everyone. I always love coming back to Chicago. Really excited for the conversation, and I love journalism awards. Of course, we don't do this for journalism, but in really dark times, it's just inspiring to see all of the important work that's being done every day and to be able to sit with your fellow practitioners and acknowledge that good work. So speaking of, before I answer your question, I really just have to say it was so amazing to see the Invisible Institute win those 2 Pulitzer Prizes this week. I don't know, Jamie, is Jamie in here? Hey, Jamie. Jamie is just, such a beacon of always centering us in why we should be doing this work. And I don't know if any of the journalists who won that Pulitzer are in here. Are any of y'all in here? Just amazing. And I hope you all are just basking. Again, it's not why you do the work, but when you can actually do work that is true to your mission and why you got into this and take home that biggest prize, is just so affirming, and hopefully will bring even more eyes to your work, funding, resources, and support, and all of those great things. So I'm just honored to be in the space with you all tonight. Okay, so now back to your question. It was interesting that I was introduced right after there was a discussion of Ida B. Wells, because I've always seen in Ida B. Wells my model of what journalism should be. So when I say journalism is activism, I don't mean that it's the same type of activism that goes out in the street and protests, right? It's not that type of activism, but we are hopefully uncovering the things that people would protest about, right? We are helping people, as Ida B. Wells said, the people must know before they can act, and there's no educator like the press, that we are helping people to understand the way that power is being wielded against them and empowering people to take action. When I think most journalists don't get into journalism because we want to be stenographers, or we just think it's interesting to write about things. When a journalist reports about, CPS, not Chicago Public Schools, I was talking about Children Protective Services, but it could be CPS, whatever it is. But when we report about institutions that aren't working, we're not doing that just because it's interesting. We want those institutions to function well. We want vulnerable people to be protected and to be served. So of course that's a form of activism. I said this at a journalism conference a few weeks ago. The motto of the Washington Post is "Democracy dies in darkness." That's not a neutral position. That's saying our role as journalists is to protect democracy. So I think that we have been led to believe that we have to be neutral even in the face of unprecedented attacks on our democratic freedoms, on whether we will have democracy or not. And I frankly think that's an abdication of the role of journalism. We do have a severe imbalance in our parties right now. We have one party that is deeply flawed but actually believes in democracy, and one party that doesn't. And so we can't pretend that that's not true because we want to appear as if our coverage is balanced. So what I'm really trying to do is tell journalists, like, liberate yourselves to take a position on democracy. If we as journalists can't take a position on democracy, we can't exist, right? A free press cannot exist if we don't have democracy. So we need each other, and our founders, as deeply flawed as they were, understood we needed to have the very first amendment, the first protection, had to be a free press, that a democracy requires a free press, and we are the only profession protected in the Constitution for a reason. So I'm really trying to call us into our mandate, and I actually think it's cowardice to pretend otherwise. It's cowardice to pretend that we have no stake in this. We absolutely do, and if we're not doing that, we should choose a different field, is what I think. So, there we go.
But how do you think, in a practical sense, acknowledging that and accepting that we have this view towards democracy should play out in the work? What do you expect to see in the work that's different from people who are doing a pro-democracy journalism as opposed to more traditional means?
I really think that pro-democracy journalists are not pretending that there is this balance in the coverage, right? So what it looks like is not wanting to call what Trump is doing what he's doing. Or if we write a story that appears to be negative about Trump, then we have to write a story that appears to be negative about Biden, because that's what balance looks like. But these two things, again, are not the same. I think not wanting for 10 years almost now, really grappling with how do you cover someone who eschews all constitutional norms? How do you cover someone who's constantly lying, but you don't want to call that person a liar because then that will appear partisan? So by always trying to appear balanced, we're actually obscuring the truth. We're not allowing the people who we are supposed to be educating to understand the dangers, the perils, because it just seems like, well, he's just, a bad candidate, like candidates are bad often. He's just corrupt like candidates are corrupt often. That's just not the case. And I think we really struggle with that as a profession, because too often we take pro-democracy journalism as being partisan. It's not partisan. Being for democracy is not partisan. It just appears that way because we have one political party that is anti-democratic right now, anti-democratic little d. But that's not our job. And so what often we're thinking is us appearing to be independent is actually kind of taking a side. It's taking a side where we're more afraid of critique from the right than critique of the left. We don't consider critique from the left to be legitimate, but critique from the right scares us. And so we overcorrect to the point of not being truthful, not being honest, not allowing people to judge. And what we'll say is, well, our job is to just report what happens, and Americans can figure it out. But if you're not reporting what happens in a way that's actually reflective of what's happening, then we can't figure it out. So that, to me, is what we have to do. It's not taking a stand in favor of a particular candidate or a particular party, but it is taking a stand in favor of actual truth, in favor of actual democracy, and saying that, yes, we do take a position that we need a democracy, and candidates that are anti-democracy will be covered in that way.
I think that makes me also think about a buzzing topic in journalism, which is everyone's favorite topic. Well, one of them, objectivity. And especially with the 1619 Project, we saw that you incorporated your family's story and history into the reporting. You included your father and how he had the American flag in the front lawn, and even interviewed your family members in the Hulu series. I'm curious then, when it comes to incorporating those personal stories into your reporting, do you think that there is a way to be objective when you're telling a truth, but also being a part of that truth? And what does that look like to you?
Okay, so I'm gonna kind of separate those two things, because the 1619 Project had an explicit stated point of view. It didn't pretend to be objective, and I won the Pulitzer for commentary, right? So that is a different type of journalism. That's a journalism where we're all aware that this is coming from a perspective that we say we're telling the lens, we're telling the story of America through the lens of slavery, and explicitly centering slavery, centering Black contributions, and yes, combining kind of personal memoir with reporting, which I've been doing for quite a while now, right? My This American Life piece kind of begins with me talking about my own school desegregation experience. One of the pieces I was most known for prior to the 1619 Project was about me choosing a school for my daughter in a segregated city. And she was in kindergarten then, and now she's about to go to high school. Still in neighborhood segregated, high poverty public schools, by the way. And so I've often kind of mined personal narrative, but also in deeply reported pieces where the facts are not in dispute. So that's what the 1619 Project was, but I think your bigger question is about this thing that I and many others, including Wes Lowry, who was formerly of the Washington Post, have pushed back upon, which is that any of us are objective, or that any report is objective, when clearly it's not. If you are a human being, you have opinions about everything that you cover, except things you don't know enough about. And as soon as you know enough about something, you have formed an opinion about that thing. And so what we are really mostly doing is pretending or trying to reflect this notion of objectivity when we actually are not objective. And I think the way that mainstream media has used that is to really deflect from criticism, right? Well, I know you're saying this was unfair, but I'm just being objective here. Well, what about our profession is objective? What beats we cover? Right? Every newsroom has a cops beat, but not a poverty beat. That's a choice. You could cover poverty the same way you cover any other institution or problem, but we don't do that. Who gets on the front page, what story gets on the front page, who we lead with, how we frame stories, all of these are subjective decisions. But we say they're objective, and then we don't have to listen to criticism and reflect. Because we are, we're here at Journalism Awards, because we are the profession who loves to award ourselves more than any other profession on earth. I mean, when I was listening to the bio, I was like, we gotta cut that shit down. You don't gotta list every damn award I've ever won, right? Like, we don't have to do that, but we do, because we think that tells us something about how great we are as a profession. And so when we focus on those types of things and this belief in this award system, then we are using this objectivity to really not take time to self-reflect, to not allow people to say, I don't actually think you got that wrong. I think you were biased. No, we're just being objective. But we're not. Who we center in our stories, I say this all the time. On any given day, I mean, look at your local newspaper, right? Look at the demographics of the city. Look at the demographics of where I live, New York City. Look at the demographics of Detroit. And then look at your daily report and ask, who does it reflect? Does it reflect the people who live in the city, or does it reflect power? 9 times out of 10, it's reflecting power. So I don't believe in objectivity. I don't believe it's possible. I don't pretend. When you're a Black woman, people presume that they can see your bias literally on your skin. But I see white people's bias literally on their skin as well. They just don't see it often. And so, to me, understanding that we are all reporting from a lens, from our class lens, our racial lens, our gender lens, all of these different things that have shaped the way that we see stories, the way we see what's important, who we value, what we cover. And I think it's important to recognize that, because how else can you report against your biases if you don't recognize that you have them? So what I advocate for, what others advocate for, is objectivity of method, which is me saying, I know that I think school segregation is wrong. I know that I'm writing because I want people not to segregate our poor black children in schools without resources. So if I know that, then I know I have to report in a way where I'm also reporting against my bias when I'm interviewing people. Am I being fair to them? Are my facts correct? Have I framed this in a way that's fair? That's the only objectivity I believe in, which is trying to make your methodology as objective as possible, but understanding that we're going to fail in that every single day because all of us are biased, opinionated people who are reporting through our own lens. I just wish we would be more honest about it. And to be clear, I'm not saying, if you're a political reporter, I should know your political views. I shouldn't know that necessarily, though. If I read your reporting, I kind of know your political reviews, right? Like we think we're camouflaging and we're not. And I don't want to know who someone voted for, who's covering a political issue. So I'm not saying that. I'm not saying tell everyone and broadcast all your biases, but I'm saying acknowledge that we have them and stop pretending that our field has ever been objective and can be, because it can't and it hasn't.
That's interesting. I'm going to let you go on, but I'm being signaled that I should let you all know that our QR code is still active to please send in questions that way. So,
yeah, I mean, I just also then am curious when it comes to your work at Howard University and how you're teaching then this to students and the future generation of journalists. What's then happening in the classrooms that you're trying to change their approach to maybe how traditional journalism has been taught?
Well, I don't think that I'm advocating to perform journalism in a different way. The skills of journalism are the skills of journalism. You have to verify, you have to get documents, you have to go out and talk to people, you have to be able to read databases, you need to be able to read a bunch, like all of those things. Journalism is a trade. Now we've professionalized it. Now people are paying $90,000 for a master's degree that I think is totally unnecessary, but that's another. Get a damn internship and somebody will pay you. But I think that the tools of journalism remain the tools of journalism. And I teach my students the tools of journalism. But I also, again, teach them, I'm at Howard, all of my students are black. Not one of them believes the media has been objective and unbiased. Not one. I don't have to tell them that. Because that's actually what motivated them to become journalists in the first place. Just like I was motivated to become a journalist because if we wanted to see black people in my hometown newspaper, we went to the crime log. Because everything else black people were doing never made it in the newspaper. But I see black folks doing all kinds of things that don't involve crime, right? So my students know objectivity doesn't exist. What they want to know then, is how can they go in a newsroom and make a difference and tell the stories that aren't being told in the ways that they don't think that they should be told. And the way that I can teach them to do that is I teach them historically informed journalism, right? Study history, understand that the thing you're writing about coming out of this school board meeting has a whole history that built up to that one moment, right? Understand that. Understand the methods of reporting. Understand who are you talking to. If you're only talking to, the CEO, you've missed out on the story because the person who actually knows the most is the secretary, right? It's the person who keeps the schedule. It's the janitor. It's the people who see who's coming in and out of that building and all of those things that get ignored. So I'm teaching them the skills of journalism. I don't have to teach them about objectivity, but I do try to liberate them because they know that they're getting the messages that somehow they're wrong for acknowledging that they have feelings about these things, or they're wrong for saying, I want to be a journalist because I believe in justice, because I want to fight for social justice. So I try to help them understand the tension between, no, we don't go out in the street and protest, but we have a different form of activism that's just as powerful, and that these things have to work hand in hand, right? Like, have any of y'all ever read The Race Beat? No? Damn, okay, assignment. This is an assignment, won a Pulitzer Prize. It's one of my favorite books. It's one of the few books I've read twice because it shows, right, that like the civil rights movement could not have been successful without the press. Because you could be out there doing sit-ins, doing demonstrations, and if they aren't being covered by the press, it's like they don't even happen. And that's what white Southern races depended upon, was that no one was going to see what was happening and no one was going to care. And so the role of the journalists, and at first it was only black journalists who were covering the protests, was to shine that light, right? To bear witness, to show what was happening. But no one thinks the black press was being objective on whether they should have rights of citizenship. Of course, they believe they should have rights of citizenship. That's why they became journalists. So that's the tradition that I teach them. But I also teach them, because of this, the level of scrutiny your work is going to face is going to be higher, right? The level of people who aren't going to who want you to slip up. So you have to perfect as much as possible your craft, so that your work cannot ever be discredited. And I know a little bit of something about efforts to discredit work.
I mean, I would love to be a fly on the wall in that classroom to hear more about that for sure. I mean, I also you brought up a lot of different points, but one thing that did stick to me was the history element, which you were talking about. Our current moments are built because of the historical moments and the decisions that have been historically made. I was, researching obviously for this interview, and there was a question in which someone had asked you, why you picked the 1619. There's so many moments that you could have picked in American history to change the narrative. And in your response, I'm kind of just thinking about that, changing the narrative, history, maybe not having always the full narrative that has included all voices and perspectives. So when you go to correct a narrative that has been accepted for so long, where do you begin?
1619, no, I'm playing. So one, my first love has always been history. I've been, I'm a nerd. I love history from a young age. History calmed me because I was seeing the narrative about Black Americans and why we struggled in the ways that we did, that you got from popular media. And then I was seeing the reality of how hard people in my neighborhoods seem to be working and not able to get ahead. And so history helped me understand, our neighborhood was redlined. Okay, that makes sense in why the houses look like that, right? And learning that history helped explain the reality that wasn't making sense based on the narratives that we were receiving. So I didn't become a historian, though, because this is always a bad joke, but sort of true. I wanted people to read what I wrote. Not everyone is a history nerd like myself, but also I wanted to be able to change things. I didn't want to just be looking back, but I wanted to be able to have some impact. But understanding then that you become a journalist because you know that narrative, more than anything else, is what drives policy. More than anything else, right? I mean, go to any sociology department, any department that's like studying data, that's studying, research that works, and you can have all the data, all the things, and that is not what's driving policy. It is, how do people feel? Look at crime, right? Look at crime policy. Look at any policy. Look at why are we not talking about schools at all in this election, right? That's being driven by who determines the narrative of what we should be thinking about and how we should be thinking about that. And I wanted to have a role in doing that. So when I pitched the 1619 project, my work had been, if I'm humble enough to think some of y'all may have read me over the course of years, then my work has just gotten longer and longer and longer. And that's because I kept feeling like I had to go further and further back in history. Like, how can I explain to you why are Chicago public schools segregated like they are? I have to go back to the 1980s. But to explain the 1980s, I have to go back to the 1960s. To explain that, I have to go back to Brown v. Board and the fact that northern districts didn't think Brown applied to them. I have to go back to Ida B. Wells when they literally took integrated schools and segregated them, right? Like, you have to keep going back to understand how we got here. If you want to change narrative, you have to counter that narrative with something else. And what we know too often when it comes to Black folks or other marginalized people is because we don't learn that history, because we don't actually understand that all of the inequality we see has been created through policy, that it's not inevitable, it's not about pathology, it's not about any of those things, it's about decisions that people, institutions, politicians have made. If you don't help people see that, they fill in the blank with what they know. And what they know is that it's something wrong with Black people. And so we have to provide another narrative that builds that history in. And I was really determined to show that you could treat racial inequality as an investigative beat. that you didn't just have to treat racial equality as like the cataloging of maladies of what are black people suffering from, as if no one's caused the suffering. That you could show that people are making decisions. And to do that, you have to build in the history. And I just think often how different our coverage of so many things would be if we took some time to study and understand the history that got us here. You know, when you think about no rush, you could have a few more minutes. Thanks, boo. First she held up the 5-minute sign, and then she was like, you know, I'm gonna give y'all a few more minutes.
It's a good conversation, good conversation.
Appreciate it. But I think about something like, and I give this example often, you know, when Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore by the police. And so much of the coverage was after the shit blew up, like when they burned that one gas station, and then all of a sudden, all the news descends, and then everyone's like, why weren't they protesting peacefully, except they had been, and we didn't cover it because we didn't think it was important. So again, talk to me about objectivity. We don't make objective news decisions. But so much of the coverage, again, was about that moment, like what led Freddie Gray to get chased down by the police and ultimately killed. But if you studied history, then you know the entire history of segregation in Baltimore, and the fact that Baltimore was had recently had to settle a long-standing housing discrimination case for violating the Fair Housing Act and intentionally segregating Freddie Gray's neighborhood, and that Freddie Gray had been exposed to lead, right? Like all of these things that help you understand that moment. But instead, people who have no context about what happened there, who have no understanding of the history, are writing about it as if it's just this one moment. And then what do we fill in the blanks with? Well, black folks, we fill in the blanks with understanding what it's like to be over-policed in black neighborhoods. And white folks fill in the blanks with, well, he shouldn't have been committing a crime. With no question of like, how does that moment happen? And that's why I think it's so important to study history. Now, you might not be able to, you know, most people can't write 10,000 words, thank God. I don't even want to read my shit half the time. It's too many words, but I can't help it. And believe me, that's the cut down version. The drafts be coming in at about 16,000 words, okay? Even though I only pitched 4,000 words. So I get that most journalists can't write that much history. But just understanding the history means that you're able to form the story in a more accurate, honest way. It means that maybe you only write 2 paragraphs of historical context, but those 2 paragraphs can be powerful. So it's more for your own edification so that you can be better at writing that story, so that you're not writing in a way that is actually harmful and untrue. So I really wish all journalists would study history and try to just get, even if it's one phone call to a scholar or a community member who has that oral history, to contextualize, because so much of our coverage is absent of that. And again, what that really means is we're not getting to truth or truths.
That's really interesting, and the idea that you have this historical context inform your reporting now, and you're going to give people the information they need, and they're going to make the right decisions out of that, right, is interesting, and we know that the free press then is this crucial aspect of democracy. What I'm curious about is that, as you alluded to, you've gone through this massive backlash with 1619, right? One of the... Okay, a little bit. Where you did everything that we're talking about here, right? You did the historically informed reporting, you gave people information that they needed to know, and some people didn't want to receive that, and as a result, they blocked other people from seeing it. How do you feel about that? Do you feel betrayed by democracy in that situation?
That's an interesting framing of the question. I don't think it's possible for me to feel betrayed by the United States, because I have very low expectations of my country. But I will say, so I expected backlash to the project. And frankly, when you were trying to reset narrative of American exceptionalism at that, right? These myths, these foundational myths that we use to justify all types of atrocious inequality and behavior. When you're trying to do that, if you don't have pushback and backlash, you probably would have failed. You know, if I put the 1619 Project out into the world and there was no backlash, then that meant I told a comforting story that people already knew and that affirmed how they wanted to think about their country. And I was trying to unsettle all of that. So I certainly expected backlash, and initially it was the backlash that I expected, but I would be lying if I said I could have predicted what that backlash would become, right? I certainly didn't predict that the 1619 Project would set off what has ultimately come the anti-CRT frenzy, that it would be, you know, targeted by federal legislation, that Donald Trump will become obsessed by it without even reading a single word, though I'm convinced he sold a lot of books for me, so I'm not that upset. So no, I couldn't have predicted that, but what I understand is the backlash only demonstrates the power of the work. Because if the work wasn't important, if it wasn't mattering, if it wasn't penetrating outside of just Black people, and Black people are the ones that I care the most about how we would respond to this, but if only Black people embraced it, there wouldn't be a need for this type of backlash. It was the fact that so many Americans of different races were having to think about their country in a new way. You know, again, this is the power of journalism, because everything in the 1619 Project, like, we didn't unearth new history. It's all based on the works of historians going back, some cases 6-7 decades. But what we were able to do is popularize it for a mass audience and to draw those direct connections from the past to the present. And that was seen as dangerous. And I have to say that's the type of enemies I have made because of the project is my greatest journalistic honor, like, in life. I have fucking amazing enemies, like. If Trump and Mitch McConnell hate your ass, you are doing something right? Like, so, so yeah, I guess when I pitched the project, I could not have imagined what it would become. I didn't even know if anybody would read it, frankly. Like, it's tens of thousands of words on slavery and its impact, and this thing we willfully have not wanted to grapple with. It's heavy, it's hard. And, you know, 5 years out, I'm still on the road every single week talking about this project. This is like a journalist's dream, that you could produce something that is evoking such strong emotion and so many conversations. So no, I don't feel betrayed, but I am daily disappointed in our country, yes. I think I don't have to tell a group of journalists, I hope, that we are in a very perilous period in our country, where literally it's not hyperbolic to say we don't know how much democracy we're going to have, and frankly, I think that's true whether Trump gets elected or not. So if there's ever a time for us to be called into our purpose, it is now. And I don't give inspirational speeches, right, or talks. Like, I want you to be scared as hell and go out there and do our damn jobs, which are to protect the vulnerable from the way that powerful people want to exploit and harm them, and to save whatever democracy we have and try to make it better. Like, that is our charge. And I don't know, maybe my work has set democracy back, but I hope not.
Well, I do think that with that, we are going to be opening it up to audience questions.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
We have a few questions from the audience. I'll start with this one as a follow-up to where you were going with the conversation about the upcoming election. What bearing does the outcome of the upcoming presidential election have on the future of journalism and your pro-democracy work specifically?
I love that they didn't trust y'all journalists to ask the questions yourselves. Man, you know, I really don't, I don't try to make predictions. I actually think that this is one of the core problems with journalism right now, is all of these people trying to predict what's going to happen. I think it's one of the reasons why we're losing credibility. So I don't try to do that. I don't know, frankly. I can say, as a student of history, we can draw parallels. I think, based on history, what I'm seeing looks a lot like what we were seeing around the period leading up to the Civil War, that level of political polarization, that level of racial polarization, you know, an entire political party that is almost, you know, being explicitly in some ways anti-democratic. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I do know that we don't, as a field, seem to have learned enough of the lessons from the last 2 elections. I don't think we have still figured out how to cover creeping autocracy. We don't want to call it that. It feels to us that we'll turn people off, or that will appear partisan if we call the thing what it is. But, you know, part of the work I'm doing at the Center for Journalism and Democracy, and I please invite you all to come. We hold an annual summit every year, and it's geared towards educating journalists, to put journalists in the room with political scientists, with historians, with people who have studied eroding democracy abroad, and can say, these are the things that we see in other countries when we're losing democracy, and we're seeing all of these things here, to help us to have the understanding, and I also hope the courage and the backbone to go back to our newsrooms and push for more accurate coverage of what's happening. So I can't predict what will happen, but I will say not enough of us are rising to the occasion. And I'm just very fearful that we are carrying weight for the erosion of democracy. We are to be the firewall. That's our role, and the firewall is not holding. So I don't know what the hell is going to happen. I just know I got to get a passport to some other country. Just playing. I'm not leaving.
With that, I think this concludes our panel. I want to thank you all for a transformative and wonderful conversation. And we'll be moving on to our awards. So thank you all so much.
How do you follow that? Thank you, everyone, and welcome, by the way. Can we again have a round of applause for that amazing conversation? On behalf of the BGA board, we're thrilled to have you here tonight as we present this expanded program to mark the 20th anniversary of the Driehaus Foundation Awards. The investigative reporting work of our finalists speak for itself, as does the vision of the Driehaus Awards founder, Richard H. Driehaus. Here's a brief tribute to these awards and their founder, Mr. Driehaus.
The Driehaus Awards to the journalism community overall are a recognition of the hard work that goes into investigative reporting.
And represent Richard Driehaus's belief in the power of journalism as a cornerstone of democracy and use as a reform tool. Richard H. Driehaus is a legendary investor as well as a philanthropist who is deeply committed to making a difference. Richard grew up in Chicago's Southwest Side Brainerd neighborhood. His exposure to the news and the power of newspapers was influenced by his paper route. Newspapers helped him get interested in the stock market and actually funded his first stock purchase at the age of 13.
He used to love talking about what he learned about being a business person. He had to collect from the people who were getting the paper. Loved journalism from an early age, just from delivering papers house to house.
Richard was self-made in many ways. He took personal interest in the hundreds of organizations that benefited from his generosity, and he truly believed in giving organizations and individuals the opportunity to help create their own success.
Mr. Driehaus himself decided some 20 years ago that investigative reporting was an effective tool for getting better government and wanted to celebrate it, not just the work the BGA has done, but the work people are doing across the state.
For democracy to thrive, government must be held accountable by an informed public through an independent press.
The mission of the Better Government Association is transparency, equity, and accountability in government for the benefit of the people of Illinois. We have been doing investigative reporting for decades. We're 100 years old now. And Mr. Driehaus committed $1 million to the BGA at a point when nobody else was getting anything close to that kind of money. And that's the point at which he helped create the Driehaus Awards. Just the last couple of years, we had the award given to WBEZ for its reporting on abuses of lifeguards at the Chicago Park District. Before that, it was a Pulitzer finalist, Quiet Rooms it was called, published by ProPublica. I think of one in 2017, Code of Silence by the Invisible Institute, looking at the Code of Silence within the Chicago Police Department.
Investigative reporting is a critical element for the press to fulfill its watchdog role and help the public understand the issues of our time.
The Driehaus Foundation has been a supporter of the BGA for 2 decades now. That has been one of the most meaningful relationships that we have had. We create conditions in which investigative reporting is encouraged and rewarded. And I think the awards have really earned a name for themselves as the most prestigious investigative reporting award in the Midwest and one of the most important nationwide.
I've known and worked with Richard Driehaus for over 3 decades, and it has always been a privilege to work with him and learn from him and observe the passion that he had for every bit of work that he did. Investigative reporters are tenacious, and their search for the truth and ability to hold power to account that helps forge more transparency and democracy for all of us. It is work that changes minds, changes policies, and changes lives.
With that, I'd love to call up and introduce Ann Lazar and Nick Burke from the Driehaus Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulette. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. As Executive Director of the Driehaus Foundation, I'm thrilled to be here to mark our 20th year presenting the much-deserved recognition to the best of Chicago and statewide investigative reporting. When we think about the awards, 2 things really stand out to me: Richard's legacy and the legacy of his foundation. First, Richard Driehaus would have loved this evening: the conversations, the connections, the joy, and the calls to action. And he really did pursue every bit of work he did with passion. From being an investor to his philanthropy and support of the missions of many organizations, including a number of the newsrooms here tonight. I think that's where his love for investigative reporting stemmed from: pursuing the lead, asking questions, and uncovering the truth, to ultimately seeing the impact made. If you're a finalist here tonight, please stand up or raise your hand. Thank you. Your tenacity and pursuit of the truth are vital to our democracy and to ensuring that communities are equipped with the information they need to hold government accountable and ensure our government serves all people. When Richard passed away unexpectedly in 2021, we knew that a major part of his legacy and the ongoing work of the Richard H. Driehaus Foundation would continue to honor investigative reporting. We support this work because it makes a better city, a better state, and a better democracy for everyone. We continue to make meaningful investments in investigative newsrooms and are proud to partner with the BGA, both in the work of their Illinois Answers Project newsroom and in helping us host and bestow these awards. Local news, and especially investigative reporting, needs our support from foundations and philanthropists like Richard to all of us here tonight. As Richard saw it, it is an investment with an enormous rate of return, changing minds, changing policies, and changing lives. Finally, I want to thank the Driehaus Foundation board members for being here tonight, and Nick Burt, our program officer for investigative reporting, for joining me to celebrate these finalists. So let's get to it.
Thanks, Ian. Good to see everybody, and hope everybody is having a wonderful evening. First up, let's review our fantastic small newsroom category finalists. We will award a winner and a runner-up for impactful investigative work from newsrooms with 9 or fewer editorial staff.
Illinois' system to protect elderly people from financial exploitation is failing, even as this serious crime category explodes. Cases are near an all-time high, while arrests and prosecutions have plummeted. And thousands of older adults are losing their life savings as state-contracted caseworkers watch from the sidelines. We found older Black Americans were at an especially high risk for financial exploitation. Financial institutions can be frontline protectors against this abuse, but Illinois ranked 49th among states in the number of suspicious banking transactions per capita involving older adults.
My investigation uncovered the Cook County State's Attorney's Office do not call and disclosure lists containing the names of hundreds of law enforcement officers with histories of serious misconduct or untruthfulness. The lists included Fraternal Order of the Police President, John Catanzara Jr., officers who used deadly force against minors like Jason Van Dyke and Adolfo Bolanos, and numerous officers who lied to investigators or while testifying in court. My investigation also found that despite stringent regulations prohibiting false reporting and lying by officers, violations are common within the Chicago Police Department. Strikingly, many of these officers who lied are still employed by CPD and also do not appear on the state's attorney's lists, highlighting glaring deficiencies in the lists themselves and in the enforcement of CPD regulations. The impact of my investigation was that 2 months after, Kim Fox publicly released an updated version of the Do Not Call list, as well as a policy document governing her office's use of the 2 lists.
Technical difficulty would evidently, investigative reporting shows that. So how about, we got the finalists in the room, would y'all want to come down and just tell us about your project? Come on down. Yeah, just swing it, okay? Here we go. Thank you.
Well. What a blessing to be here today. Thank you so much for giving us the space to maybe share a little bit about our project. Missing in Chicago came out of a machine learning project called Beneath the Surface, which utilizes narrative justice and data science to parse through police misconduct records and identify other types of context where police misconduct is being reported, but it's not so easy to access. So, there's a category called operation and personnel violations, and the subcategory is failure to provide service. But you may not think that that looks like an allegation where a DCFS staff member is saying that a law enforcement officer is closing a case before finding someone. And so Sarah Conway and I joined forces in top of 2022 maybe, and started using those police misconduct records as a bit of breadcrumbs with Chicago Police missing persons data, Cook County medical examiners data, CPD homicide data. We read lots of autopsies as well.
We saw when we looked at the misconduct complaints that most of them were made by women, and most of them were black women, and they were making them for how they had been treated when their children went missing. So we knew that from the beginning, as a personal value, and also just what showed up in the records, is that we wanted to focus on the experience of women and femmes, and specifically black women and girls and their family members, because we know that they are disproportionately impacted by this issue. They go missing more often than other populations, and black people in Chicago make up 70% of all missing persons cases.
So we ultimately identified lots of data discrepancies, issues that really drive the kind of obscurities that are accompany missing persons. You think like, well, most people come back. That's what the narratives say. I mean, in fact, City Council met in 2017 and they said, look at these juveniles, like not nearly 100% of them come home or returned or are found. And we identified 2 cases within that time period, which where Chicago police claimed that this young person came home safe and sound, and they were later found murdered, right? And so in one of those cases, a young person, 2016, she was actually being sex trafficked at the time, and she told her friend on Facebook, I came to this party and he won't let me leave. I don't know where to go. December 20th, they closed her case. September 24th, she was murdered, right? And so it's like, it calls the question, was CPD ever looking for her in the first place? And also, it calls the question, what we can learn from missing persons cases, ultimately as a form of violence prevention.
One of the things we also found was that police were delaying and denying families, asking families to wait 24 hours, telling people that their daughters or their sisters or their mothers were off with men. We saw that even when detectives were assigned, they would wait. We found one family, they waited more than a year, and then the man who their sister and their daughter had been in a relationship with, Sonia Rouse, the last person she was seen alive with, he ultimately died of a fentanyl overdose. And the family had to inform the detective that he had died. Mm-hmm. And I remember her mother telling us that she felt like when he died, that also what had happened to her daughter did as well, and that she would never know what had happened. One of the things, we could talk about the impact of the project, and we're very grateful that City Council and Brandon Johnson, they introduced an ordinance to potentially create a city task force for missing and murdered women in Chicago. But Trina and I often talk about the families. There's one family in particular, Shantae Bohannon, a young person who witnessed her boyfriend. He was shot to death in front of her. She later went to apologize to the family and never left the home. She was found 2 days later after her mother had went to the police department and begged them to help her find her daughter. She was found naked in a black plastic bag in a garage. Her mother, when we accidentally called her, we didn't mean to. Long story. Anyway, she had kind of said that she was never going to speak to media again, and she'd actually stopped talking about her daughter. And a couple months back, we were invited to a church on the west side. We were given a Black History Month award. And she was actually standing in front of the mic speaking to about 6 different TV news stations, talking about how she felt like God had put 2 people in her life that had helped her find her voice again. And so what we hoped out of her reporting is that families could find some healing, some validation after they had been really silenced by the Chicago Police Department and deeply harmed.
Yeah, thank you. That was Missing in Chicago from Sarah Conway and Trina Reynolds-Tyler from City Bureau and the Invisible Institute. Our final finalist in the small newsroom category is Cicero Independiente and Muckrock for The Air We Breathe, people-powered investigations about environmental concerns in Cicero. Would anybody from Cicero Independiente like to describe your work?
I'm very nervous, so bear with me right now. Yeah, so just on the recap, this project has been going on for like about a year or so with Muckrock. It started early last year, and so it came about with we talked to a few residents, and they raised concerns of how the air quality is really bad in Cicero. And historically, Cicero is a very industrialized area. There's a lot of factories in every corner, not necessarily every corner, but in very populated areas like in high schools, elementary schools. And so we were inspired by these conversations, and then with the help of Mockrock, we were able to locate different air quality monitors. We tried our best to do it in every corner of Cicero, and turns out we were able to find that we have one of the highest bad air qualities in the Chicago area, more than Little Village. So for the recap, we were just as a recap, with our work, we just tried to we aimed to just cover a story that expresses the importance of environmental justice stories, specifically in Cicero, just because it tends to be overlooked at sometimes. Yeah, that's it. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for being willing to come down and take the podium unexpectedly. Our runner-up tonight, our 2024 runner-up in the small newsroom category is Hundreds of Cops Can't Testify in Court by Max Leslie from the Tribe and the Invisible Institute. And our 2024 Small Newsroom category winner is, it has been a good week for them, Missing in Chicago by Sarah Conway and Trina Reynolds-Tyler for City Bureau and the Invisible Institute. Yeah, thank you for coming back to the stage. For our large newsroom category finalists, we will also award a winner and a runner-up for impactful investigative work from newsrooms with 10 or more editorial staff. This year, the Independent Judges Committee had trouble selecting only 4 finalists, so we have 5 large newsroom finalists this year, which is an amazing sign of the ongoing high-impact work that Chicago and Illinois investigative reporters are producing on a daily basis. 1 second.
One story has grabbed attention like few others. Actually, I think it was one uncomfortable interview that got things started. Meet Tiffany Henyard. She's the mayor of a small suburb about a half hour south of Chicago. She actually has 2 jobs. She's also the supervisor of the largest township in Illinois. When our investigative producer, Andrew Schrader, first came to me and said, "You're not going to believe the credit card charges," I was instantly intrigued. Dalton is a working class community But that didn't slow Mayor Henyard and her team's spending. Some of those charges are for you, though.
No, sir.
You didn't go to Las Vegas?
Mm.
What is that? You didn't know if you were in Las Vegas?
Of course I do.
Were you?
It's not paid by them.
Did you fly first class to Las Vegas?
Any other questions?
So policing practices have really been a high-profile issue in American politics these days, particularly when it comes to racial disparities. So we knew that there'd be something when we took a look at the traffic stop data, there'd be some stories in there that we could report on. And after collecting this data, 2 decades worth of traffic stops from across the whole state of Illinois, we had 42 million traffic stops to look at. The result of which is we found that racial disparities have actually increased in the 2 decades since then State Senator Barack Obama sponsored this legislation. More recently, police departments have started to comply less and less with the law requiring this data collection, and the state has done little to oversee and correct some of these problems. As far as the impact goes, there has been some legislation introduced around pretextual stops. More importantly, I think our impact has been open sourcing this database so that local newsrooms, student journalists can take this information and are starting to do so and localize the story and report on policing and traffic stop disparities in their corner of the state.
So we found that Cook County criminal courts are operating under layers and layers of chronic dysfunction, and it's become so normalized that the people who work in the system barely even register it as a problem. But the result of all this dysfunction is delay after delay after delay in really high stakes cases. If you're charged with murder, you can expect to wait 4 years without a trial at least. There are even people waiting up to a decade or longer.
This hurts defendants who have a right to a speedy trial. This hurts victims' families who are left stranded without closure. And this is just not normal in big jurisdictions. We looked at New York, we looked at LA, looked at other major cities. They don't have the kind of delays that Chicago has. Court leaders knew about these problems. There's decades and decades of research that they are well aware of. And after we published the series, court leaders really didn't say much to us about what they were going to do. Of course, they didn't really say much to us before either. But we did see movement after the series published. Court leaders began a long-promised effort to track reasons that cases are delayed, and more judges began following basic but long-ignored recommendations to issue deadlines for the tasks that attorneys need to do to get a case towards trial.
This was an unprecedented investigation. We obtained a database from DCFS, which normally would be confidential, but this involved foster children, and we fought for it for over a year, and we started mining for stories, and one of the big stories we uncovered was that 90% of all allegations of abuse and neglect involving foster kids went unfounded. That is an astonishing number. And so we dug deeper into that database and started to find foster parents that were repeat offenders. We were able to uncover a foster care parent that was a repeat offender who continued to get foster children after allegations of abuse. And one of the children that she got ultimately died. And because of our investigation, we tracked that woman down, and Chicago police opened up a criminal investigation into her. We found a lot of these cases weren't really being looked at. They certainly were not all making it to the police. One of the other things we uncovered was how many homes children had been put into, called placements. We found one woman had been in 67 homes in her childhood. No one had ever looked at DCFS this deeply. Using their own data, we were able to tell all of these stories of abuse and neglect and multiple placements. We're holding them accountable.
Our investigation found that a historic criminal justice reform law meant to free thousands of dying and disabled Illinois prisoners had failed to live up to its promise. The Coleman Law was meant to release other incarcerated people who were terminally ill or medically incapacitated and reunite them with their families. But what we found is that the vast majority of prisoners who applied for release under the Coleman Law were denied, even though a doctor had determined that they had less than 18 months to live or were severely disabled. One of the hundreds of prisoners denied release was Philip Merritt, a 71-year-old with dementia who had lost the ability to speak and care for himself. Merritt was denied release by the bipartisan Illinois Prisoner Review Board, which has final say on all medical releases. Our story revealed how some members of the board denied more than 70% of the medical release applications before them, with Republican members of the board denying many more cases than their Democrat counterparts. But the board ended up approving Philip Merritt's second petition for medical release. He was released to his family around Thanksgiving. We mailed hundreds of copies of the story to Illinois prisoners whose medical release applications were denied.
Thank you again to all of our large newsroom finalists. Our 2024 runner-up in the large newsroom category is Dalton's Political Dysfunction by Andrew Schrader, Ben Bradley, and Vince Tagle for WGN-TV. They cannot be with us tonight, so they get to avoid having to come down to the stage and improv their speech. But finally, our last award tonight, our winner for the large newsroom first place is Profiled, the state of traffic stops in Illinois by the staff of the Investigative Project on Race and Equity in WBEZ Chicago.
Feeling when you want to win something but you don't want to speak in public. There's an old saying, there ought to be a law, and sometimes there is, and nobody's paying attention. We've talked a lot about that tonight. This was a story a long time in the making. We thought about and kicked around this idea for years, and the idea that information about who's getting stopped, racial disparities actually increasing over time after a reform law was passed 2 decades later. All this data is just sitting in a server collecting digital dust. There's been plenty of other reporting by our colleagues at Injustice Watch and Black Club about the Chicago police practices. We were able to expand on this into the entire state of Illinois across 20 years. And to find that the problem is getting worse really just, I think, is a call to action that we need to have a greater level of transparency, first of all, into the government agencies that are in charge of fixing these problems. And as journalists and newsrooms, we have to find ways to be more efficient because there's just more and more of these types of problems. The amount of effort it takes to analyze 40 million rows of data, it's difficult, it's impossible if you don't have great friends who are backing you up, who can bring these stories to life, and to be able to hand some of these stories off to the next generation of reporters, journalists who are really, you have to kind of watch out and see what's coming next. But I'd like to also just add at the end here, Save Vocalo Radio.
So that concludes tonight's program. I have to say, this has just been astounding to see, as I said earlier tonight, the through line from Ida B. Wells to Nicole Hannah-Jones to the work that has been recognized here tonight. You may not know that one of the winners in the large newsroom category was sort of the newest infant child of investigative reporting in Chicago. The Investigative Project for Race and Equity is an offshoot of the Chicago Reporter. When the Reporter was going through serious problems a couple of years ago, a group of alumni got together and decided that that mission needs to continue. And to see them recognized here today, it's just incredible. It says something. Says something about the resiliency of journalism in the face of all we're dealing with today. The financial problems, the kind of challenges that Nicole was talking about. And we couldn't do it without the people who came here tonight to support this great work. So thank you for being here. Congratulations, everybody. Let's go ahead and drink.